Eric.
Omar.
Eric, I will acquiesce to your demands simply because you're a hunk. I came here, I saw, Austin Baraki. We had your buddy on, Jordan. And sure, in that episode, it wasn't an episode actually, it was an adjacent thing on my YouTube. I said, Eric, Austin's going to be on. Let's have that pain science roundtable. I really think we could delve deeper into this topic. You know, in the last one, we spent about an hour and 45 minutes struggling to define what pain is. I'm confident within 3 to 4 hours, we could probably do it in this podcast episode today. And then Eric said to me, but Omar, what do you think about the D? And I said, I beg your pardon. And I thought it was like a Skype issue. And they said, vitamin D. And that made me turn full circle. I'm like, you know what? There could be something here. We have a hunky doctor. We have someone who's done their PhD research on this. Let's talk about it. We could save that for our 200th episode. What was that be? It would be end of the year or something? Pain Science Part 2. Austin, you're in. Eric, take it away.
I think that was a perfect introduction. No one's confused by that. And just to make you feel even better, Austin, I actually thought we'd already had you on, but then I realized it was actually Jordan Feigenbaum. And then, then Omar was like, there's multiple people associated with barbell medicine. And I said, what's barbell medicine? And at that point, I got a rude message from Alan. So it was just a rough, awkward scenario. But anyway,
Eric.
We've cleared that up. Yes, sir.
So, Austin, I'm sorry. Yeah, we don't want to misrepresent you. So I'll ask you just a pointed question because I know, pain science is very important. Would you agree with the following statement? And I take inspiration, of course, from one of the great philosophers, Dalton from Roadhouse. And he has the line, pain don't hurt much. So is that a fair analysis of what we're like? Do we need a roundtable part 2 if we just all agree on that conclusion?
I think we're done here. That's all there is to it, really.
Neve, welcome to Iron Culture. We're so thrilled to talk about vitamin D. Austin, you can just hit that back button and we'll see you later, buddy.
I'm out of here. All right, later, guys.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's good to join the conversation. I feel like it's going to be interesting and scary.
No, mostly the latter. Absolutely. And Neve, I'm really glad that you are a recent addition to the Sigma Nutrition team because we've burnt every bridge possible with the rest of Sigma Nutrition. I don't know if you're aware of Danny Lennon's previous appearances on the podcast, but I think the last time it started with telling us to F off and then he hung up. And we were able to get him back on the call.
I get that all the time, yeah.
That's just a regular occurrence.
He has no HR department, so it makes it really difficult. He is HR, so all complaints go to him. But I'll move it forward somewhere else.
Well, yeah, just be aware that, when you have someone who may or may not be a sociopath working in the HR department, it's going to affect the company culture to some degree. You're new at Sigma Nutrition. I've known Danny for going on almost 10 years now, believe it or not. I think I was on the Sigma Nutrition radio back in 2013 or 12. And let's just say I feel like we're probably some of the closest of friends because I'm still alive and I've known him that long. While I don't know that everyone can say that or anything because they're not alive anymore because he probably killed them is what I'm getting at. But, those are just rumors. We don't want to substantiate them here. But nonetheless, he hasn't taken kindly to us implying that he may or may not be a serial killer. So that's where we are. But I just want to say thank you for coming on the podcast despite those adjacent issues that we may have dealt with. And big thanks to Danny for actually responding to the DM and getting me your email because that's it shows, I think, some emotional progression on his part. So, yeah. Or
really, really good manipulation. I don't know.
Yeah, it's probably I'm actually being played and I don't know it and I don't know how, which is even scarier. So let me properly introduce our guest because right now all people know is that you work with someone who's dangerous and that Austin is actually a different person than Jordan, which I don't think is really a real introduction.
That's all the pertinent information they need.
You can't be more dangerous than vitamin D deficiency.
Oh.
Hey, look at that. Okay, segue award for Dr. Aspel in the house. That's amazing. We should actually send you a segue. One of the things you write on, but we don't have the funding for that. So we'll just say thanks and leave it there. But no, so in all seriousness, we've got Dr. Neve Aspel on. Like I said, she's a new addition to the Sigma Nutrition team, which is a fantastic resource in all seriousness. And you specifically did your PhD on vitamin D, which I think is awesome. In addition to that, you obviously have a background in human nutrition, which you did your bachelor's in, and you are also an expert in data analysis. You've got applied statistics background in postgraduate research. So I think you did your PhD titled Vitamin D in Aging: An Investigation into the Role of Vitamin D in Cognitive and Physical Functioning in Community Older Adults. So obviously, you're a perfect candidate to be on the podcast to talk to us about the role of vitamin D. Then we have Dr. Austin Baraki. And when I say doctor, I mean like an actual doctor, not like I have, a sports science degree. And then, by the way, half of these are my wife's, so it makes me look far more intelligent than I am, but they're not close enough for you to see. So it looks like I have at least 12 doctorates behind me. But no, I basically just have one PhD in strength and conditioning, which is about equivalent to 2 summers of community college. So, but in opposition to that, you, Dr. Baraki, you're an MD, like the real doctor. So like if we were on a plane together and someone was like, hey, we need a doctor, I'd say, I can tell you about the history of periodization. And they'd say, he's dying. And I'd go, oh, well, that guy, him. And I'd sit down and go back to watching reruns of The Office on the little screen. So anyway, so glad to have you on, part of Barbell Medicine, Dr. Austin Baraki. I know you've talked a lot about vitamin D and you have the clinical perspective. So I think between the two of you, we'll be able to give our listeners, the deer lifters who just want to get more gains, a very nuanced take and perspective on whether they should be supplementing with vitamin D or not, and in what instances and what nuances need to be known about it.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Tis a pleasure. So, Omar, I'm going to start with you, our real expert on the topic. How common would you say, just based on the questions you get, interactions, topics you've done, and just as a man of the people, do you think vitamin D is like a relatively common supplement among lifters?
Not anymore. I think it already had its kind of heyday, maybe around a decade ago, where, lifters, anything that could be done well should be done in a maximum quantity. And I think over a decade ago, like the super dosing was a thing. Like I'm talking 2010, 2012. But now everyone's moved on. I mean, I don't know if you heard, there's this thing, Eric, testosterone that people seem to be talking about. If only we had an episode on it. It's past its prime. When it comes to athletic performance or, the purported benefits, I think everyone has already moved on past it, unfortunately.
Makes sense. I mean, going on to things with much more evidence behind them.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, first, I'm offended because to me, 2009, 2010 is basically present times, but I think that's just the fact that I'm nearly 40. And I'm clinging on to a time when I felt relevant as a human. But I actually do specifically remember I was on the bodybuilding.com forums, and Tommy Jeffers, shout out, back in the day, he was on living that natty life, the Lane Norton series on being a natural bodybuilder. So Tommy Jeffers, he's a natural pro bodybuilder, and he was the first one I saw talking about vitamin D and kind of the more mechanistic research that was back in the day, how common deficiencies were, and how it was basically a pro-hormone, which is a technically true statement, but very misleading if you're comparing it to like andro, and was like, you know what, I take 10,000 IUs a day. And I thought, hey, if someone else does it who is jacked, I should probably do the same thing. And that was the level of my scientific expertise in maybe 2007, 6, something like that. So yeah, I do think it is a relatively commonly recommended supplement in the kind of quote unquote evidence-based world. You'll find, this is my take, Omar. You're right. It's probably not at the heyday as it was 10 years ago. But I think if we look at like what's the typical stack that a strength athlete has, they've got their creatine, caffeine, pre-workout something, and then they've probably got like a multivitamin, fish oil, and they may or may not be taking vitamin D. And I don't know why that is, because some person might have written a book where they recommend that, and other people might have backed it up. Might be called the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. I may have to change my book after this episode, but nonetheless, I think we need to start with like, what is vitamin D? So let's kick that over to you, Dr. Aspel. What do you think is the best way to describe vitamin D in terms of its role in the diet and its function in the human body?
Yeah, I think the first thing when you say the role in the diet, I think that was originally what we thought of when we thought of vitamin D. So vitamin D was It's actually the anniversary of the experimental findings of vitamin D, the importance of vitamin D in the prevention of rickets. So that was 1922, and that research was first conducted. And essentially at that time, they determined that a lack of certain foods containing vitamin D contribute to this weakening or malformation of bones in children. And that's why it got this status of being a vitamin. Again, and as you've kind of already mentioned, that's this kind of a pro-hormone, or you hear that it's a steroid hormone, and it does have its chemical structure is that of much more similar to steroid hormone. But I think sometimes when you hear that word, you expect bigger effects maybe potentially from it, or you expect kind of more. But that early work did allow us to try and understand vitamin D and its role in bone health, and particularly with it in combination with calcium as well. So a lot of the time when we talk about vitamin D, we're not really considering calcium, and most of the evidence that we have for vitamin D is in bone health and with the combination of calcium as well. So that's important. But essentially, vitamin D, we get such a small amount from food. We get about 10% of our vitamin D status is attributed from food sources. So most of it comes from UVB or sun exposure. And I think that's what makes vitamin D a little bit tricky for a lot of people, because there's actually so many limitations to how you can obtain and store and process vitamin D from sun exposure. So that's kind of one thing, moving it away from being a food kind of source and more so to being bioavailable, more so through your environment. When we obtain vitamin D, then it has literally no effect until it's activated in the body. So it's quite complex, and there's lots of different fractions or different components to vitamin D to make it activated. It doesn't really matter where you get it from. It's inactive until it gets activated in the body. And I think there's a lot of confusion, particularly as you mentioned, since like 2010. And it's a lot in media, and it's come back around now during COVID as well, where people think vitamin D has really, really potent effects. So every time we think about vitamin D, there's a lot. The worst I think I've seen was, I don't want to slag her, but Oprah said that vitamin D will save your life. And I'm like, there's a lot of people listening to you, Oprah. Yeah. And there's these really grandiose statements around what it can do. And then during COVID as well, it was the same. And a lot of interaction I get from people is, should I be taking vitamin D for this? And usually what this is something really, really extreme. Whereas vitamin D is more so just a marker of general health. I think we kind of know there's been so much research in the last like 10, 15 years around different levels, status, how we measure it, how much we should take, where we should get it from, how it works, why it's working. It's still all really, really unclear. And because we don't know any of those parameters, all of the research we have is also really muddled. And so all of the scientific communication we have is just really misleading and confusing. So it's kind of in a bit of a ball. And I think when I did my PhD, I submitted my PhD in 2017, and it was kind of coming out of that phase a little bit. There was more kind of structured guidelines. But as you see in the last like 2 years, it's been kind of exploited again, I think, in the media a little bit. So we can get into it more, but there's lots of different kind of risk factors, particularly one thing considering athletes. So a lot of the work I did was in muscle function and physical performance in older adults, older being people over 50, which is what's categorized in the literature, but in a later kind of stage in life. And those recommendations are very different to shouldn't be very different, to what the recommendations are to an athlete. So the prevalence rates are very similar, and the recommendations are also very similar as well. Whereas in sports, we always want something to give us a little bit more, or to know that it's going to add a little bit more.
Beautiful. That's a fantastic introduction. And I think I want to circle back to a very basic aspect of vitamin D, where most of the time when we talk about vitamins, we're thinking of obtaining them through the diet. But as you mentioned, we actually are potentially getting most of our vitamin D through sunlight exposure. Talk to me a little bit more about how that works, and what does that mean for someone who's potentially in an area of the world where there's not as much sun, or they are just to live a lifestyle where they are more vampiric in nature, and don't leave much. They're home.
Yeah, it's UVB exposure, sunlight exposure is actually quite complicated. So I think I live in Spain, so it's it's a sunny country, but don't live in this most south region of Spain. So my latitude, the latitude where I spend most of the summertime in, I don't get adequate amounts of UVB rays to generate vitamin D against my skin. So even in countries where it is quite warm, there is still periods of time where you're not getting adequate sun exposure. Typically in countries that are kind of northerly of about 40 degrees north and above, between the months of October until early spring, you aren't able to make any produce any UVB vitamin D through UVB, which I think a lot of people don't expect. If they go outside in the winter on a sunny day and they've got sunshine hitting against their skin, they think they're kind of producing vitamin D. You won't produce any vitamin D. And essentially that's just because of the position of the sun in the sky. So it's called the solar zenith. So this angle that the sun hits the sky, it's not, the rays are traveling too far in order for that UVB ray to be producing enough, to be of enough strength for you to be able to produce vitamin D. So even if it's sunny out during the winter months, if you're in northerly latitudes, you won't produce any vitamin D. So you can produce it in the summertime if you expose yourself to sunlight, particularly during the time of day where the sun is at its strongest, so like between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. And you need to expose enough skin to be able to generate it as well. So having just your hands and your face out, you won't generate enough. It's about 10%. But if you have your arms and your legs out, you will. And you need to be not wearing any SPF. So I think that's something that people aren't totally familiar with as well. That's really, really important, because there was campaigns back in like the 80s and 90s, particularly in Australia and countries where it's much hotter, for public health campaigns for prevention of skin cancer, because the incidence rates of skin cancers were increasing and they were really encouraging SPF use. And then they started to see an increase again during these periods of vitamin D deficiency because people were following the guidelines. And of course, it's really, really important to protect your skin in that sense as well. But if you are going to try and obtain vitamin D through sunlight during the summer months, it doesn't have to be it shouldn't be an extended period of exposure without SPF. So even in SPF, quite low, even between 8 and 10, will block about 92% of your UVB. So you need about 20 minutes if you have fair skin. So this is really, really important. There is categorizations of skin color. So as your skin gets darker and your the pigmentation in your skin increases, you need to expose yourself to UVB for longer. So it can be up to an hour. It's a bit easier to manage if you've got fairer skin, because you should maybe take about 15, 20 minutes. Your skin can go pinkish, but you shouldn't burn. So you should stop before you know that you're going to burn. And then you can put your SPF on and put your hat on and cover yourself up and sit in the shade and whatever else. When you think about athletes, it depends on the type of exercise that they're taking part in. So if you're thinking more strength performance, it's more likely going to be indoors, unless you have the ability to work out outdoors and have a gym outdoors. And even with endurance sports and people maybe who do running or cycling and have more outdoor kind of exposure to sunlight during the summer months, it will depend on what clothes you're wearing as well. So if you're covering up your body, you're not going to get as much exposure of the UVB on your skin as well. So there's lots of factors. You can store whatever you get from that sunlight. So you're going into winter and you could be sufficient if you get enough adequate exposure. But then when the sunlight is taken away from you in the winter period, then you're going to get less and you're going to become a bit depleted. And that's where supplementation is important, because food sources are just so limited. And the food sources that we have that contain vitamin D, they're not very widely consumed. And then fortification strategies vary quite a bit as well. So unless you're eating certain dairy, or I think a lot of non-dairy produce now supplement or fortify vitamin D as well. But in terms of UVB exposure, it's quite tricky. And a really good one I heard a few times, maybe it's the quality of people I spend time with, but a lot of people have said to me, I think I'll get loads of vitamin D. I'm sitting here in my conservatory. I'm like, but there's a big glass window between you and the sun. And they're like, yeah, but I can feel it, it's warm, but the glass blocks out all UVB. So you're not producing anything by driving around in your car or whatever it might be. So, but you still get UVA rays, which are the kind of skin damaging rays. So I think there's
get all the cancer and none of the vitamin D. It's fantastic.
all of the wrinkles. Yeah, you look absolutely wrecked. You won't get a color, but yeah. So yeah, there's lots of things around UVB that are important to consider, but I think the practical kind of advice is, if it's the summer period, middle of the day, go outside for 15, 20 minutes. If you've got darker skin, go outside for double that time, maximum of an hour, put your sun protection on after that, and then just forget about it. You don't need to think about it anymore. It becomes more of a consideration later on. And then probably not as much of a importance to your listeners, but people who train at altitude, that has an effect as well. So you're actually a little bit closer. So UVB rays are a little bit stronger. So during the winter, you might get more UVB. But it's probably not as relevant, I suppose, to strength kind of training, that kind of metabolic work.
That's great background. Thank you, Neve. Is there anything else, Austin, from a kind of like a background perspective of understanding how we produce vitamin D in the body from sun exposure and get it partially through the diet as well, and things that you wanted to touch on to kind of clean up?
Yeah, I think, as she mentioned, there's tons of really complicated physiology going on kind of underneath with how it actually operates and how it's regulated, how it's activated, how it's inactivated, how it's transported around the body. And all of this tends to be pretty underappreciated. And so, you mentioned that there's this period where there's tons of hype around vitamin D. And to be honest, I still see tons of the hype. Of course, I work in an inpatient hospital setting. I'm up on the COVID situation, so that's like a big hot topic there. So vitamin D is still kind of as hot as ever in that realm. And I have frequently people sending me papers about, look at this paper with vitamin D and this outcome or that outcome. And so it is still very much an active thing. And so I agree with the conversation so far. And so, regarding the idea that it's not quite a vitamin in the traditional sense, like we've thought of many others. It has, probably much more multi-system effects in the body. And its effects on bone and bone mineralization and things like that are probably the most well-characterized that we have. I think that we have come to believe and expect that it has widespread effects in tons of tissues for a variety of reasons. But one common kind of point that is cited is that we can find the vitamin D receptor actually scattered across a whole bunch of tissues in the body. And so then the conclusion is, vitamin D must be having some action in this. So it may be muscle and brain and, various other tissues. The problem, and this will be probably a theme, I might harp on this point multiple times throughout this conversation, is that I tend to, particularly from the clinical side and making recommendations to, real people, is emphasizing and focusing as much as I can on actual outcomes over mechanisms. Because we can view all sorts of hypothetical mechanisms of how, vitamin D might do this or might do that, or it has receptors in muscle, so it must be good for muscle. It has receptors in brain, it must be good for brain. It has, this sort of thing, and draw conclusions and make recommendations based on those sorts of mechanisms. But the history of medicine is absolutely littered with examples of things where we thought we understood how something worked based on a mechanism, and we made a recommendation based on that mechanism. And then when we went and studied it in real humans and we found the outcomes, it didn't work. It didn't do anything. Or in some more concerning context, we actually found that we caused harm with the thing that we were doing. So my perspective on this topic, like in general, is very much focusing on outcomes over mechanisms. And so definitely agree, the amount that we get from our diets is relatively limited, although, national fortification programs are a thing in certain places, like in Finland and things like that. They're doing some more aggressive fortification in their foods to try to boost their population levels. But yeah, sunlight tends to do more of the work. And then in our body, we have multiple activation steps that are needed. So it's regulated, basically. It has to be activated mostly in the liver for a first step, and then mostly in the kidney, but tons of tissues can activate this. So it exerts its effects. And then additionally, there are inactivation steps to basically, control it on the other side to make sure it's not going haywire. The last point that I'll make, and this is probably something else that I'll come back to, is because it's one of these so-called fat-soluble vitamins, it's something that is actually carried, much like many other proteins and other hormones and things like that. It's actually carried throughout the blood on a binding protein. So it has like a vehicle carrier that carries it throughout the bloodstream. And this is something that is not typically directly measured or thought about or accounted for in a lot of contexts. And it can really mess with how we think about these numbers, because there are things that can impact the amount of that binding protein around. And so, for example, inflammation, which happens all the time for all sorts of reasons, can decrease levels of that binding protein. And so anytime there's even a hint of inflammation, these levels will drop. And so if you do a quick little cross-sectional study, because it's convenient, you have your sample, you can pull some data, you can correlate anything with anything. And that is how we end up with kind of the state of the evidence around correlational kind of associations with vitamin D and literally every disease you can possibly think of. As she said, it's a marker of good health in that healthier people tend to have higher levels, sicker people tend to have lower levels. And so, the extrapolation that people tend to make, the intuitive kind of assumption that people will make is, oh, look, this study found that low levels are associated with bad things, so I should supplement and it'll make that bad thing go away. And if we zoom out and think outcomes over mechanisms, let's look at real outcomes when we supplement people. Does it have anywhere near the magnitude of effect that we would expect based on this association? Effectively never plays out that nice and neat in reality.
No, that's a fantastic meta discussion that I think we have had across multiple episodes of Iron Culture, Omar, where the existence of charlatanry, that's not a word.
It's now a word.
Charlatans. No, we're gonna use different grammar structure. I got this. Charlatans will often exist you like that? See, will hang out in kind of the fringes of science and focus on mechanisms rather than outcomes all the time. Dr. Ben House talked about this a lot. And many times, like I can think of another one, like right now, the cholesterol conversation in some of the very low carb communities, they'll start the conversation with cholesterol is so important in the body. It does X, Y, and Z, and it will kill. Like if you don't have this, you'll die. It's like water. Like you can, but you could literally do that with almost anything in the complex physiology. And if that is something that you're hearing someone emphasizing in lieu of these applied outcomes, that should set off some degree of an alarm bell for you. If we understand that evidential hierarchy, where we look at RCTs and meta-analyses of RCTs as our highest quality evidence, and someone's going, I'm going to go back to the original, in vitro research and animal research, talking about the mechanisms first to kind of get you excited and use sciencey words and position myself as an expert, and then make a claim that isn't supported. Just be aware for that sucker punch coming around from that entry point. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic meta conversation, and it doesn't just occur in people who have a pseudoscientific claim. Like there's a lot of vitamin D reviews which start with the introduction of like vitamin D is associated with all this stuff, and especially even when it's framed for athletes. There's a really good review, by the way, by Dahlquist, Dieter. We've had Brad Dieter on before, as well as Cole, where if you read the introduction, they talk about how it's related to exercise-induced inflammation, tumor suppressor genes, neurological function, cardiovascular health, glucose metabolism, bone health, and skeletal muscle performance. And they've cited, a paper for each one of those. And then they also go on to say, hey, and by the way, close to 90% of the people in the world might have inadequate vitamin D levels. And I think the natural conclusion from that is, well, oh shit, I should be supplementing, or I should be, as Neve suggested, getting naked and going out in full sun for multiple hours without any kind of skin protection, which I'm pretty sure is an accurate representation of
what I said.
That's what I thought.
Representation.
Yeah.
I'm here to spread the word. I've got another podcast in about 10 minutes. So
Yep. You spread the word, and all our listeners will go out and spread all kinds of stuff that they shouldn't be in full sun.
it actually reminds me, you can also get it from sunbeds. So if you don't want to frighten your neighbors, it's another option.
Where's the fun in that, though?
Yeah, I mean, that's... You kind of just...
I wouldn't encourage sunbed use, but some people do have higher levels and they're not really sure why. And it's like, how often are you out tanning? Yeah. So it's another source.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of people just don't realize that, especially when they're talking about a vitamin. They don't think about all the other potential sources. So yeah, I think that's a really helpful meta discussion, really helpful background. I wanted to go into that next claim. I have seen multiple times different claims in different populations in different parts of the world, which makes sense based on what you were talking about, Neve, of either deficiency or insufficiency or suboptimal, quote unquote, levels of vitamin D. So how do we measure someone's vitamin D status. And how simple a measurement is that? And does it change in different populations? That's my next question.
Yeah, so vitamin D status, if up until kind of in the last couple of years it's changed slightly, but before that we measure that. So in that two-step process, that activation process and vitamin D metabolism, the first stage, as you mentioned, we get 25-OHD. So this isn't the active form, but it's kind of got a longer life than the active metabolite that's generated in the final stage of that process. And that's the metabolite that is typically measured when we're looking to determine somebody's vitamin D status. It's done typically through a venous blood sample, but there's also been a lot of test kits developed around like skin pricks, so you can also kind of do it yourself at home, and they've been quite well validated. I remember when I was doing my PhD, I did a lot of population type analysis on, biobanked vitamin D data and vitamin D concentrations. And there is a lot of variation in terms of accuracy and reliability depending on how they're measured in the lab. So what technique is used in the lab. So mass spectrometry is considered the gold standard. And I think most clinical labs would use that type of method, but a lot of population-based work and research type labs would use different methods that maybe aren't quite as reliable, and there's a lot of variability in them. So kind of even at that, a lot of the estimates that we're getting of deficiencies and different ranges of status of deficiency as well, and sufficiency in different populations, they're all being measured through different lab techniques. So there's a lot of variability there, and that's what's led to a lot of maybe inaccuracies in what levels are important. We kind of have a very good idea of what optimal ranges are if we're talking about kind of general health, and we don't have any evidence for anything beyond kind of general health and bone health. So the one that's most often used was the kind of original classification by the Institute of Medicine. And I think most countries kind of go by this, or most labs go by this. You'll have variations. The Endocrine Society have kind of more extreme values. And then you have a couple of scientific groups. I'm not sure if you've heard of Michael Hollick, who's done a lot of the kind of early work on this, and he would have his limits through the roof and down the road kind of on what's optimal. But the Institute of Medicine essentially defines status in a couple of different categories. So you're considered to be very deficient if your serum 25-OHD is less than 12.5. And that is a really, really low level of vitamin D. And then you've got deficiency, which is anywhere between 12.5 and less than 30 nanomoles per liter. Inadequacy is between 30 and 50. You're considered to be adequate if your levels are kind of between 50 and 75. And then you've got this group, other groups of scientists who will say that you need to have your levels more than 125, more than 150 for them to be sufficient. Toxicity kind of occurs at much higher levels. It's been reported at levels kind of around 225 or between 225 and 300. So it is a little bit more difficult to get to those toxic levels. But I think a lot of the conversation and argument with vitamin D status is around, well, what's enough? We kind of know what's enough. Having your levels between like 50 and 70 nanomoles appears to be quite protective for, your bone health and just general health. And when your levels get really, really deficient, that's where you might come into problems. Mm-hmm. But I think that most people use that. There's loads of other metabolites as well. And there's loads of other fractions of vitamin D that could be analyzed that might be a better indicator of your vitamin D status. So I think the active form is only kind of circulating it only has a life of about 15 hours. The 25-OHD is a little bit longer. But we definitely need to do a little bit more research to see if it's combinations of these or ratios of these compared to other blood components that maybe give a better indication of vitamin D status. But for now, I think 25-OHD is the one that's generally used in a hospital setting or in a research setting. That's the blood sample that they would typically take.
Gotcha. And insufficient would be characterized as below 75 nanomoles per liter. Is that the Endocrine Society's one, or?
Yeah, the Endocrine Society would say less than 75 for bone health. So they're specifically, that's kind of the thing that's interesting is like there is disease specific vitamin D guidelines proposed with like therapeutic effects, and they range from normal, what are seen as normal levels between like 50 and 75, right, like through the roof, and much, much higher levels where we've never demonstrated that there's any benefit. But there could be adverse consequences of taking vitamin D at that amount, but we don't really understand that because we always seem to analyze vitamin D as well in isolation, and we kind of forget that when it comes to nutrients and diet and vitamins, they don't just all work in isolation. They all work in they're all dependent on each other as well. But most vitamin D research just looks at vitamin D and doesn't consider any other nutrient status kind of going on around it as well.
Right. Austin, stuff you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just a couple things. I definitely think it's important to point out the issues with reliability of the test, depending on the technique, whether it's like the immunoassay versus the mass spec kind of methods. And that can impact, imagine that you have a whole bunch of studies using varying methods with varying reliability, and then you want to go meta-analyze them. You are just, more likely to get null stuff as a result. It's going to come out in the wash, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'd point out is, I don't know what the geographic distribution of your audience is, but for those who are in the United States, where we typically use more annoying units, you
nanograms per liter. Is that what it is?
Yes, just so that people don't freak out, because any American listener is going to hear the numbers that she said, and 100% of them are going to be deficient because they're all going to be lower. So in the U.S., the typical units are nanograms per milliliter instead of nanomoles per liter. So you'd have to take whatever numbers she said, rewind, listen to her number, divide it by 2.5, and then that'll translate into a nanogram per mil unit.
So 30 nanograms per milliliter is equivalent to 75 nanomoles per liter.
Right.
I mathed for them.
There you go. And 20 and 50 for the 50 nanomole kind of cutoff, depending on where you want to set your cutoff. And so that's another thing, is we try to have a sense of like, what is the prevalence of this, insufficiency or deficiency in the population. And this is like a fundamental concept in like biomedical testing and biostatistics. Is prevalence is going to depend on where you set your cutoffs, and all cutoffs pretty much for a continuous kind of measurement like this is going to be necessarily arbitrary. And you are accepting that you're going to have some false positives and some false negatives, and you are ultimately trying to set your cutoff at a point that gives you the best discrimination between individuals who you would, and you don't necessarily get any benefit by just being labeled as insufficient or deficient. You're trying to identify those who are at higher risk of downstream consequences, right? So that you could intervene on that and hopefully mitigate those risks. How well we can do that is, again, an open question for lots of outcomes, particularly non-skeletal outcomes. So there's just a couple extra, I think, important side points when it comes to measuring these levels. And one thing that we were mentioning before we started recording, you were talking about some of like maybe there's some ethnic variations and things. And so there's, as I mentioned, some of these other components that regulate this system, including the fact that vitamin D is, again, carried on this binding protein. And there's some controversy in this, but maybe some ethnic kind of variations in vitamin D binding protein levels, which may impact what their kind of normal ranges are. And so you might want to, the goal would be for us to have, effectively outcome specific or disease specific ranges that are also population specific, which is like getting pretty complicated and tough to do. And I can't really think of too many other, medical conditions where we have, data and recommendations that are like that really, really, really granular with a high degree of confidence in that realm. But it's important because, I'm sure maybe your listeners might be, familiar with, say, testing for blood testosterone levels, for example, and people might be familiar with the idea that, hey, we have testosterone, but it circulates bound. It's bound on albumin. It's bound on sex hormone binding globulin. There's free testosterone. There's this bioavailable pool. There's this bound pool. All this stuff. There's similar physiology going on here too. So like pulling one number out of the blood and thinking that you've gotten a very confident, accurate sense of this person's like overall status. It's a little fuzzier than that, I think.
No, I think that's a really good point. And there's a review from 2018, if I recall correctly, on vitamin D in the athlete. And I don't know, obviously it's a review, so I haven't read all of the studies they're citing, but they were talking about how in Black and Hispanic men, there are not relationships between 25-OHD status and bone health markers, but they exist in Caucasian men, and they go, hey, we might think this has to do with, different metabolization of vitamin D. And I think that's that obviously there are racial differences in some health markers, but it's not a very common thing. And since there's been so much population-wide data across the globe, it kind of throws a wrench in a lot of the prior analyses. Where are we with that in trying to determine specific ethnic groups' relationship between health and vitamin D status? And are there newer markers? Is there a free vitamin D marker now that is maybe more appropriate in certain ethnicities? And do we have any answers on the horizon for how we can get better markers for that? Or is that even a real thing? Is that a disputed finding that there are racial differences?
I think it's still extremely early. I think I know the paper you're talking about. There's a group in Liverpool, I think John Moore's University in Liverpool, who do a lot of research into vitamin D in the athlete. And I think they've proposed this as well. And they've looked quite a lot at muscle biopsies and looking at circulating, like acute circulating vitamin D metabolites following exercise. And they've showed that there is more bioavailability of certain fractions of vitamin D afterwards. But I think this was a very small study, and I don't think that there's been much kind of concrete evidence after that. But I know that that's something that lab is particularly focusing quite heavily on. But I think the importance of knowing whether it's total vitamin D or whether it's bound to the receptor or what's happening there is still very misunderstood, or just not understood at the moment. I think initially they would have focused quite a lot on ethnicity being a greater risk factor for low vitamin D status, based essentially just on sun exposure and needing more time in outdoors and needing more sun exposure on the skin, and there's increased risk there, but also overlooking vulnerabilities in terms of Black and ethnic minority groups in certain research areas that they were working in, and their overall had a lower kind of health status as well. I did publish a paper, I think it was in 2018, looking at vitamin D status in multiple different groups and the prevalence of vitamin D deficiency and the range of prevalence in all groups in general populations. And there was other kind of more defined populations, and it ranged from 0 to 100%. And that was only 3 years ago, because they all used I think the first study started with less than 10, and then it went up to deficiency being less than 80. So because I initially was going to do some sort of meta-analysis, and I was like, what do I do with that? Like, that's a mess. There's no comparison there whatsoever. And then from that I did in RCT, and I thought it was important. And I think it's an important thing in research as well. Obviously, open access to data so people can play around with your levels and check, if they have their own criteria for deficiency. But in my own RCT for those findings, I published the results based on 3 different cutoffs that were kind of most commonly used, so people could make sense of it a little bit more then. And yeah, if you put deficiency at like less than 80 and really high levels, and you're like, well, I've got deficient population, and it didn't work. Well, it didn't work because they weren't deficient. Well, you'd less likelihood that whatever you're trying to show didn't work because they weren't deficient to begin with. They weren't going to get much higher in their vitamin D level. And it just made everything confusing. I think that's why there's a lot of confusion around bone and muscle, is all of these different criteria for deficiency, because they're enrolling people at the start of the study that don't need vitamin D supplementation and that have adequate levels. And then there's no response because you're not improving a negative situation. Right. So I think there's still a lot of confusion, and there's still like a lot of disagreement around what levels people will accept, because like you said, that beyond kind of, financial conflict of interest in research that we always talk about, but there's also, researcher profile. And if you've just been publishing on vitamin D for the last 15, 20 years and you stuck by this criteria or cut off of minus 100 or whatever, or less than 100, you're not going to budge on that quickly.
Yep. That totally makes sense.
That's what's continuing, I think. And that's still with this resurgence of interest in vitamin D, like you'd mentioned, Austin, as well. It just doesn't go away, this interest in vitamin D, but it's come back. I haven't done much active research in vitamin D in about 3 years, but since COVID, I've just had the most random emails from so many previous colleagues or research participants going like, what's going on? I'm like, what's going on. It's what's going on with vitamin D and every outcome since, 2010. But yeah.
Okay. So we've gotten, this is not necessarily the cleanest of measurements, depending on the method used, and that there may be population level or population specific differences in what even is a insufficient amount of vitamin D, or vitamin D status, I should say. And we have also focused on the idea that we should be outcome focused, which I think is a really good recommendation. So I think the natural question that might come from that someone has is, all right, so I'm an athlete. I want to make sure that I do have a decent vitamin D status. I'm not sure whether I should use this, 50 or 75 cutoff, but should I go get a test to determine my vitamin D status and then make a decision about supplementation based on that? So what do you guys think about that? Is that even a reasonable thing for an athlete to do?
I'm happy to begin here.
I have opinions.
What will the real doctors say?
Yeah,
because that's very much a clinical question. And so what you are asking is screening worthwhile? And so then we have to define what screening is. Screening is the process by which we test people who have no signs or symptoms of disease. They're apparently healthy people, no complaints, feel fine, look fine, doing fine. You're doing tests in an attempt to identify a particular condition, be it a disease or a risk factor for disease. And it must be a situation where if you identify that condition or that risk factor for that condition, you have an intervention that you can perform on that. And furthermore, when you offer that intervention earlier, by virtue of the fact that you tested them and found this earlier while they had no signs or symptoms, you have the potential to alter their trajectory of health downstream. So this is a multiple kind of set of criteria that we use to determine what is worth screening for and what is not worth screening for. Other areas of screening that people might be familiar with, for example, might be colon cancer screening, because people having, polyps or tumors in their colons don't typically, they can be present and progress for a while without causing any symptoms. And if we do this test and we screen and we identify, we can intervene early and prevent them from progressing to advanced cancer, for example. However, there are many other medical conditions where if we perform a test trying to identify this kind of thing earlier in the stage of that person's life while they have no signs or symptoms of disease, offering an intervention may actually not help them. It may actually harm them, or there may be conditions for which we don't even have a treatment. So what is the point of even testing for it? So this is that was 90 seconds on general concepts of how we decide what to screen for and what we shouldn't screen for. And so if we have agreed, as the record shows, that we are going to be outcome focused, then we should basically have evidence that if we perform widespread population screening for blood vitamin D levels using 25-OHD, if we take people, all comers who have no signs, symptoms, no issues, and we measure their blood levels, and then we identify those who have low blood levels, if we supplement them to normalize those levels, do we confer benefits on downstream health, morbidity, mortality, any of those things that outweigh the costs, basically? And so that is where my position at present is, I don't believe so. I don't believe we have evidence that population screening, just checking blood vitamin D levels on all comers, people who, again, look fine, feel fine, asymptomatic, don't have major risk factors for deficiency, that testing them and supplementing those who are low will significantly alter their health trajectory over time. Now, I would not dispute you're going to find people whose levels are low. And sure, we can make those numbers look pretty. I can make your blood levels whatever I want them to be on a blood test. That is a trivially, straightforward thing to do. The question is, am I actually helping you live better or live longer? That should be the goal of healthcare, not just identifying problems and fixing them, even if it doesn't help you or if it may cause harm, right? So I can be very confident that if I screen you for high blood pressure, and I find that you have a blood pressure of 165 over 100 in the office, and you have no symptoms, because high blood pressure often doesn't cause symptoms, I can be more confident that, hey, getting your blood pressure under control is quite likely to improve your health trajectory over time, maybe mitigate your risk of a stroke or some visual complications or heart disease or any number of things. How confident can I be that identifying somebody maybe whose blood vitamin D level is maybe 40 nanomoles in the office, who has no signs, symptoms of any condition, and supplementing them up, that I'm going to make a substantial impact on their long-term health outcomes or their physical performance or any of these kind of things? I wish I could hang my hat on something and say, yeah, I can be confident that this is going to help you. Rather, I'm saying you're going to be spending money on a supplement and taking the supplement every day, and I have no real, strong basis to say that you are highly likely to benefit from this thing. So that's kind of my overall position on screening all comers. Now, there certainly are people who are at risk, people who have, certain forms of malabsorptive, like intestinal conditions, people who have like cystic fibrosis, people who have certain other medical conditions for whom you are at high enough risk to be like significantly deficient, and that degree of deficiency is likely to compromise your health to where, yes, I feel better about screening that person, even if they're not giving me, they're not coming into the office complaining like, I feel like my vitamin D is low or whatever symptom that might be. But for people who don't have those risk factors, I just have a lot harder time. And in fact, the overarching societies like, who make clinical recommendations on this kind of thing. The big one in the United States is called the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force. And there are also subspecialty organizations and societies. And effectively, none of them recommend for widespread population screening. At best, they say the evidence is insufficient to make a recommendation, which is kind of where I am at the moment. Although the more time goes on and the more, like RCTs come out on supplementation in general population context, the less likely I am to end up recommending that. But no society actually currently recommends widespread screening. They recommend more targeted testing for those who are at risk. And so, I'm imagining who are, if we're talking more towards your listeners of this podcast, people who are, for the most part, probably healthier than the average person who I might see in my hospital ward, for example. They're listening to a podcast about health and fitness and training and lifting weights and exercise. And if they're sitting there on their, and listening in their car and they say, I feel totally fine, my training's going fine, I have no, issues going on at the moment. Is it worth me going and getting tested because I just want to know? I would say, no, you probably don't just want to know. Like, I think you're exceedingly unlikely to get substantial benefit from this. Even if we were to find your numbers were, a little bit below these lower limits of the range. I think that these are likely going to fluctuate over your lifespan. And again, I don't have strong evidence to say if I test you and I supplement you, unlikely to help.
But doc is going to be my next question. All right. But doc.
Yeah.
And this is not necessarily Eric Helms' position, but it is definitely, I think, the way our listeners probably think about it. If we were to do a screening for, am I as jacked and strong as I want to be? The answer is always going to be the same forever. No, I failed that screening test, right? And if we screen me for, will I spend money to get neutral to positive, marginal, negligible, potentially placebo effects? The screening answer is also absolutely. So in this case, let's say I'm also, hypothetically, someone who spends far too much time indoors watching this exact YouTube podcast right now, and then I go train indoors to lift weights, and I happen to live in an area where I don't get a whole lot of high-quality sun exposure that would raise my levels. What about me, doc? Can I get tested, and then would it hurt for me to supplement a little bit with vitamin D for dose gains? Not concerned about health, but maybe I just want to try to optimize everything as some people are wont to do.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the wanting to optimize. That's a biohacker kind of goal that I hear actually a fair amount. And I do understand the perspective where people say, if there's a chance it could help and the risk is low, then why not? And that's like a kind of more of an individual level decision. If you feel that way, like I'm not here to take charge of the person's life. I'm just here to make medical recommendations based on the best available evidence and kind of come to a shared plan with the person. And so if they hear this whole thing and they say, I hear you, I still want to do it, and this is what I'd like to pursue, then, you're an adult, you can go for it. I think that the part of the area where I might take issue, though, is that, like, if that is the view or your justification, we could come up with a literally never-ending list of things that also fit those criteria for things where there's not great evidence for, there's not great evidence against, it might help, it probably wouldn't harm, should I do this? And you could be supplementing all day, every day for those gains, but based on, that kind of level of evidence. If we want to look more specifically at, like, how likely is this otherwise completely healthy person to put on a bunch more muscle mass due to supplementing vitamin D, I would again just ask for I'd like to see the outcome data on this, because hey, if it's there, I would take it, right? I'm on the same boat as you guys. I would like to deadlift 800. if this can help me get there, it's a couple, even if that's a couple percentage points away in performance, again, those small benefits for people who are, at a certain level or with certain goals, totally, I would do it. But I haven't seen compelling or convincing kind of outcome data on that. And if you want to hang your hat on mechanisms, again, you can do that. That's just not a place that, like, from either a policy standpoint, from a healthcare systems standpoint, you're not going to get, say, like insurance coverage, you're not going to get them to cover stuff based on some, like, mechanistic, like, rat paper or something like that. It's like, I want to see, how is this actually going to help people? Right. And that's kind of what I'm most concerned with. So I think, to your question, it's very much an individual decision at that point. I just would prefer that people, like, hear out this whole kind of idea, because you could use that justification again for so many things, if you really wanted to be, picky about it.
I think that's a great answer. And, this is actually something now to not just be the fake person, but this is something I've actually thought about myself, because I am someone who spends a lot of time indoors, doesn't get a lot of sun exposure. I am interested in, like you, I guess I'm interested in deadlifting 800, but I probably think I should get the 600 first. That's just where I'm at, but absolutely, I make decisions like that. And I would say I'm in a very lucky position where I have the ability to read research, because I've had the training to do so. And I would say, even with that, my read on the vitamin D research, and this is something I think I mentioned off air, I have gotten less confident, not pro or con, but just generally, as more research has come out. And I have seen trials showing, for example, I think there's one on either judo or taekwondo athletes where you saw, a reduced rate of illness in those supplementing with vitamin D who had low levels. And there's different findings in studies where they, specifically screen for having low levels or don't. There's a meta-analysis by Hahn that if you don't confuse standard deviations for standard errors, shout out Eric Trexler for reanalyzing this, you see a small, we're talking literally 0.2, I think, D effect size overall impact on strength from supplementing with vitamin D. But yeah, that is a pretty small effect that is inconsistent. So I guess I would like to kind of, and first, before I shift the conversation towards what's our read of the literature thus far on performance, I just want to ask you, Neve, is there anything you want to add or any perspectives that you want to give to
Yeah,
what
I totally agree.
Austin said?
Like, national screening is not necessary. I think it's just a waste of healthcare resources. I don't think everyone needs to get a vitamin D test. There's much better things to be checking and monitoring, and like you say, if you do identify something, what's going to be the positive outcome of intervening? And with vitamin D, you can provide supplementation. So the big thing that irritates me with vitamin D, though, is we have a lot of public health campaigns and none of them are effective. Like, prevalence rates aren't getting any lower. Okay, so whatever public health bodies are doing at the moment, or for the last 10, 15 years, it doesn't work. People aren't taking supplements, and they either don't want to take supplements, or they're not going onto the internet to see what white papers are available for every nutrient and what they should be doing and what they should be taking. I think they're putting too much responsibility on people to figure all of this out themselves. But I think that's one big thing, is that public health campaigns don't work for vitamin D. And in terms of, it's like self kind of trying to manage your own vitamin D levels, I think it's just having a little bit of awareness around what the risk factors are. And I don't think this is any different from an athlete to the general population. I think our requirements are exactly the same. There's no evidence to suggest that you need more if you're an athlete. And it's not about having these crazy high levels. It's just about staying within this kind of sweet spot of most of the year, you're pretty much within this range that keeps you kind of okay. But you need to think about those factors that we talked about: your sun exposure, how much time you spend outdoors, and what your diet looks like, because it does contribute as well. And then if you are taking supplements, I've seen various strange practices with supplements. You can get vitamin D in the last couple of years that can be administered through a spray. And one spray gives you enough, 1,000 to 2,000 international units a day, which is more than enough. But I've seen people using it as like a mint spray, and just been I'm like, whoa, you've just taken 20,000. So it's kind of being sensible around supplementing. And then if you are a coach or an athlete and you have reoccurrent, say, injuries or stress fractures or fractures, there's something going on there, go get your vitamin D and everything else checked, so your other endocrine kind of markers as well, and just make sure that everything's okay there, particularly in sports where there's maybe a restriction around dietary components or restrictions on body weight and stuff like that. You need to be a little bit more conscious. But yeah, I don't think everybody needs to go out and do a test. And then I think it brings in these kind of, it adds an element of elite to elite sports as well. Like not every sport club or group or athlete has a sports nutritionist who works with them constantly, who does these samples, who measures this all of the time. So some people don't have the opportunity to go and just like pay for testing frequently. So if you can get tested, it's kind of good, I think, to know where you're at. I think if you're low, it mightn't have an effect. You might notice something straight away, but I'm not sure if chronically low levels for years and years is a good idea, particularly when you're at, in your peak in your 20s, 30s, and you're healthy, and maybe it might have a consequence later on. Because most of the research that's done as well are these like really short-term interventions of like 1 or 2 months where like nothing is going to happen. And again, with the outcome and probably talking through the studies now, I don't know how they would have ever anticipated to see something after, supplementing someone for a week. And but that's I think what we're doing at the moment doesn't really work, but I also don't think that we should be sending everyone down to a clinic to get tested.
Omar, what I think I'm hearing is that they would give different advice depending on the situation, which is wild to me. I really like things that I can fit into just like 150 characters, personally. But yeah, the impression I get is maybe if, let's say, you were hired by like the Norwegian weightlifting team to be a team doctor, and if you were put on a panel to give public health advice, you would potentially treat cases differently. Maybe if you had an athlete who was getting ill regularly and had some stress fractures, and they were never getting sun exposure through their job and there was an indoor sport, and they were in a weight class restricted sport where they were potentially just consuming less overall nutrients, you might be like, hey, let's get this checked and potentially supplement. But if we were then to be like, hey, what's Norway's policy? You'd probably give different advice. Is that an accurate surmisement of your guys' position?
Yeah, I think that giving advice to individual humans needs to be appropriate for their individual context, and honestly, even for that one athlete situation that you mentioned, who might be having injuries or stress fractures or is in that context, I would not frame this as, oh, I would be unsurprised to find a low vitamin D level in that person. But I would also not say, oh, once we get you supplemented and get your vitamin D up to 50 or 75, you're going to be good. That's because that's wrong, right? Like this person's situation requires much more aggressive management. Their training loads are probably too high. Their nutrition is probably either incorrectly set up or frankly inadequate for the person. And so, again, it's like, I'm
overtraining. I have low energy availability, and I'm entirely sedentary outside of my sport. But so I'm just going to take vitamin D.
right. Like that's. I think that's really an important thing because I'm sure we're going to get into some of this discussion around performance and stuff like that. But people want it to be a miracle pill, miracle supplement, just like I'm seeing again with COVID. They're like, oh, if I just have plenty of vitamin D, there's this paper that shows that people with high vitamin D do better with, if they get admitted to the hospital than people with low vitamin D. And so, if mine's high, then I'm, there's no chance that I'm going to get sick. And it's like, well, I have some bad news for you. That's not how any of this works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think in the UK as well, they've always, obviously encouraged supplementation during the winter time, but they did come out with a campaign last year where they offered free supplements to anybody who was defined as COVID, at risk to COVID. So those clinical markers, they did say this is not related to COVID, but I think that gives a really confusing message.
So now it's like, very smart. That's not going to work.
Yeah, they're like, look, this is not related, but we just said we'd just mention it again to vitamin D, particularly you people who might get COVID.
Does it come with ivermectin, or is it just?
You should pay extra for that. No, you need an extra set of criteria.
Yeah, because I think it's a 2-for-1 discount, and we probably wouldn't even be in the situation. Let's be honest, if we had
that type
of public health. Yeah, there you go.
It's time to speak out.
Sorry, say that again, Omar.
It's time to speak out. We can't be silent.
No, we can't. We have to make a stand based on faulty evidence and reasoning. and really just a lot of fault. But but anyway, no, that's really helpful. I think the difference between giving advice to large groups of people and individuals is something that anyone who produces content in the kind of this modern period or makes recommendations really needs to think about too. And I think that's often something that the fitness influencer out there typically makes that error. I think it starts as, hey, I've got some level of popularity because I am personally successful, and I'm going to share my personal anecdote. And I think if the person, has the disclaimers of, hey, this is just what worked for me, that's not necessarily a problem. But one thing you said that I really liked, Omar, and I think the last episode we did, was that responsibility scales. And I think, like, from a pure moral philosophy, like, it shouldn't, like, it's not my responsibility if someone misunderstands what I'm saying, if I was trying to be clear to the best of my capability. But I think from a statistical perspective, you need to understand, if you have 150,000 followers, 2 million followers, 50,000 followers, or you've got a podcast, the probability that someone is going to misunderstand you is almost 100%, And as someone who goes to unnecessary levels of pain to be clear in what I say and try to explain my positions, I am 100% of the time misunderstood by someone, either because they heard it through telephone, maybe it's English as a second language for them, or maybe I just dropped the ball. All of those have and will continue to happen, unfortunately. So I think you do need to be very careful and speak to your audience, and you don't get to absolve yourself of responsibility. So I love that you are both trying to give context here as to how does an individual make this decision, what other things do they need to consider, versus what should we be doing as a society, which I think is a really important distinction that often doesn't get made. And even within the scientific community, where a researcher is more focused on one specific population, while a clinician is thinking more about, the how they act in clinic. So, I don't know, kudos. That's all I gotta say. So, yeah. No follow-up question there. I just wanted to hear myself talk. So moving on, actually, before we get into some of the outcome studies that are on performance, let's talk about the inverse. I think we kind of tangentially mentioned that the difference between a quote unquote optimal level, which is not agreed upon necessarily by different groups, and the difference between a unhealthy level, an excessive dose, is quite vast, which is good, right? That means that someone is unlikely to hurt themselves if they are supplementing with vitamin D. Although then you just brought up people who are using it like Banaka. So let's talk about the possibilities of excessive vitamin D intake and what can that happen? Does it happen? And then what are the consequences?
Yeah, so based on the mechanism of what one of the main ways that vitamin D exerts its activity is it increases the absorption of calcium and phosphorus from the gut. Of course, again, we mentioned it has receptors in a bunch of other tissues. It probably has effects in a bunch of tissues, but that's again, one of the best established mechanisms. And actually, there were some very interesting studies way back when we were still characterizing this stuff as far as okay, how does this really, and how does severe deficiency end up contributing to bone disease like rickets? And they would have knockout mice and stuff like that. That really, if they were allowed to express the vitamin D receptor in the gut, then the rickets kind of phenotype disappeared when they were able to reabsorb calcium from the gut. Even in children with it, if you fed them super high calcium diets, you could kind of overcome that deficiency and restore some significant bone health. So that's a major mechanism of what it does, is increasing calcium and phosphorus absorption from the intestine. And so the main manifestation of toxicity is called hypercalcemia, which is just elevated blood levels of calcium. And this is something that can happen, something that does happen, something that I have seen for several reasons. Sometimes I've seen it in the context of people who are taking way too much supplemental vitamin D. Perhaps they were prescribed to take a not unusual supplementation regimen of 50,000 international units once a week and misunderstood the instructions and took it once a day. Not a great move. Oops. You're going to end up toxic if you do something like that. Or just chronically, not necessarily that high of levels, but taking, levels that are still too high and for long enough that can manifest. And sometimes the person might have another undiagnosed medical condition that predisposes them to having high blood calcium levels. And then they don't know about it, and they decide to start supplementing vitamin D just for general health. And then the combination of the two kind of unmasks this condition that they might have, be it a parathyroid disorder, certain other kinds of autoimmune conditions, things like that can manifest. And so high blood calcium levels, the higher they get, the more severe the symptoms can become. They can cause, neurological effects, confusion, things like that. It can impair, electrical conduction through the heart. It can contribute to kidney stones. It can cause substantial muscle weakness and a bunch of other pretty sometimes dramatic complications, severe dehydration, death from like very, very, very high levels. Again, not very common at all, but certainly can happen and is possible if you go too hard on the subs.
Anything to add, Neve?
No, I agree with it all. I think a lot of the evidence is kind of more anecdotal stuff. So things where there's been, erroneous kind of lab things kind of occurring where there's kind of high levels of vitamin D present in supplements and they just got passed through the quality control system by accident type thing. But just one thing to kind of note is intoxication or toxicity with vitamin D is only seen with synthetic forms of vitamin D. So vitamin D supplements or fortification. So don't worry about sitting out in the sun for too long and those kind of consequences, because your body can knock that off. But yeah, there's different ranges. They say kind of over 250 nanomoles in blood, and others say 500. But I think one of the bigger studies was just a case study of somebody who had ingested 1 million international units of vitamin D, and their blood levels got to 120. So obviously that wasn't great. And I think their calcium, which should be like 2.2, I think, milligrams, it was 15. So obviously that was clearly a bit of a disaster. But that's one case, and there's very few cases kind of reported. So, yeah, I think the risk for toxicity is really, really low, but then there's absolutely no need to be taken too much either.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just because it's safe doesn't mean you should just go crazy with it.
Gotcha. So let's talk about the state of the data if we were to look at some of the controlled trials on this for performance. I think I mentioned off air. I don't remember if I mentioned on air, but I mentioned it, that there is a meta-analysis by Hahn and colleagues that looked at strength outcomes with vitamin D supplementation, I think published in 2020. And it overall found a non-significant small effect. And it seemed to be largely driven by isokinetic knee extension and not by upper body strength tests like 1RM testing. And Eric Trexler, shout out, Dr. Trex, he did a review of this in Mass, noticed that there were some pretty wild effect sizes that were highly variable, and reanalyzed it and found that they had mistaken some standardized some SDs for different variability markers. Standard errors, that's the word that I've known forever that I just forgot right there. They took some SDs for SEs, so standard errors for standard deviations, which can really inflate an effect size. And when he reanalyzed it, he actually found a small but significant effect for isokinetic knee extension strength, and he surmised that probably why it didn't manifest in bench press was just because it's not as sensitive of a error measurement if you don't have calibrated plates, etc. And this is a very small number of studies that were meta-analyzed. So I think your average gym bro, who's evidence-based inclined, like many of our listeners, might look at that or look at a few of the other scant studies and be like, neutral to positive potential benefit, unlikely to be toxic. I'm just going to go with 1,000 IUs a day and I'll just be good with it, especially because I stay indoors too much and listen to Iron Culture. First off, what is your guys' take on the literature? Is it actually neutral to positive, or do you think it's neutral to neutral? And then second, is there anything wrong with a low maintenance dose, just a quote unquote maintenance dose, even though they haven't gotten tested? Should they get tested? And where do we finally stand based on all that?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. So previously, after my PhD, I worked in a food clinical trial company and as a scientific manager designing RCTs. And one of the hardest thing, obviously, around designing randomized control trials for nutrition studies is that placebo group, because it's very, very hard to control people's diet and lifestyle, even with their best intention. Vitamin D is extremely difficult to do in an RCT because you have to be really clever in your timing. So if you're going to start it, and if you're in northerly latitudes, you might start it, in the autumn kind of period. But then people are deficient towards the end, so you're trying to boost people who are also going down. And then if you start at the end of winter, everyone's outside, everyone's going to go up. No one's truly ever a placebo in these studies
Right.
of vitamin D, which makes it really, really difficult to interpret the findings then. Another big thing is it's very, very hard, and rightly so, to get ethical approval to randomize participants who are deficient for a period that's long enough to show if there's any impact of taking vitamin D supplementation on any of these outcomes. So typically, minimum for vitamin D status to improve and to have any kind of metabolic adaptation, depending on what your outcome is, like 3 or 6 months is kind of what's required, like a longer period of time. But you're not going to leave someone vitamin D deficient for a 6-month period. It's whether they'll be okay or not, the ethics board aren't going to allow you to do that. So all of the interventions that I have seen, particularly a lot of the bone health ones and the muscle performance ones, are in older adults where there's other stuff going on at that time. So there mightn't be as much exercise performance happening, but there's also other physiological changes at that stage in life, particularly in a lot of the intervention studies where they recruited just female populations as well in midlife. So I think they've complicated everything. I think a lot of the reports that we get around muscle strength and physical performance, if you go and actually look at the papers, they're in older adults, and when you're talking about muscle performance or physical performance, it's standing up and sitting down from a chair. How does that transcribe into performance sports? It's very, very different. But that's where, and a lot of that evidence is muddled into meta-analysis, where you've got elite athletes, non-elite athletes, young athletes, older athletes, and you're like, there's so much variability physiologically and training wise in all of these people. It doesn't make a lot of sense to put them all in together. Some of those studies come out with positive findings and others don't, and then you put them together and you've got nothing, and no one really understands anything any better. So I think that's where vitamin D research is, and that's why there's so many yes and no's throughout it as well.
Yep.
There is some okay kind of interventions, but they're all focused on bone health. I think anything new where we're looking at immune function, or there's most of it for skeletal muscle function is observational. So it's saying this, if you've got low vitamin D status, there's a trend towards all of these things, but there's also a trend towards poor outcomes in multiple different health outcomes if you've got low vitamin D status. And we know that all of these risks are very tightly linked. So I wouldn't say strongly that there's much evidence whatsoever for muscle performance. There's some smaller studies that have looked at kind of sprint performance, but a lot of the athletes started at different vitamin D status or vitamin D blood concentrations, and most of them were adequate to begin with. And then there was no effect in those, which kind of went against all of the tissue biopsy and animal studies. But that's all we kind of have at the moment, is like what you said, is all these bench type studies. And that's what people are picking up on, and that's what people are running with. So yeah, I wouldn't have a massive amount of confidence. But I think a lot of it, if you think back to, before vitamin D, it was all vitamin C and the immune system and immune function. And kind of all of that evidence as well is pretty much, it is quite weak. So if we're looking at vitamin D and immune function and kind of risk of maybe kind of burning out through training periods, extended training periods over like a training program for a couple of weeks or months, you're going to be more tired. Your immune system might be suppressed to some extent. Vitamin D isn't going to stop you from getting the cold or getting the flu, and there's like very minor evidence that will reduce the duration if you do get a cold or a flu, but it's very minimal, similar to vitamin C. It's very, very minimal, and what you're doing is just spending a lot of money on supplements that really aren't offering much, a massive amount of benefit.
Can I pick up on, so that fantastic answer, thank you. I want to pick up on that one point you made about the difficulty of studying vitamin D in controlled trials. And this extends really, for the listeners, to any nutrient. Because if you were to do a pharmaceutical trial, there's a drug that is not found in the diet typically, and then there is a placebo. So you're controlling. One group has zero exposure and another group has exposure. But when you're trying to do a study on, say, athletes, and you recruit a team, you're going to find out once you start the study what their vitamin D levels are, which is going to be dependent upon their sun exposure, geographic location, like you said, and their diet. So you can't have a zero exposure group. You're just essentially getting all kinds of exposures in this group, which is going to muddy the waters a great deal. And that is true of pretty much all controlled trials when you're looking at nutrition. So tough one for sure. And I think that's a great point.
And nutrients aren't as potent, as a drug. So your response, you're looking for tiny, really, really marginal, very, very small responses. And if you consider all of the evidence for single nutrients and different outcomes, really, if you take all of that seriously and you're looking at vitamin D, then you should be measuring all of those other nutrients as well to exclude and rule those out. Whereas it's just crazy that people just focus on this one specific nutrient that isn't going to be that potent, that's not going to have the same effect as if you put somebody on a statin or a different pharmacological drug, but we're expecting the same response. We're using the same sample size with small number of people for short periods of time. And we know that dietary patterns probably indicate more than, looking at a single nutrient for 2 months and then expecting somebody to either no longer, have a dementia or be able to squat something that they never could before, or, these really kind of outlandish claims.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple really important takeaways to highlight in this little section or this topic. So previously I mentioned my emphasis on outcomes over mechanisms. I think the other thing, like if I could get people to understand something very fundamental about this particular topic is there is this concept in physiology called the acute phase response. The acute phase response describes basically our coordinated physiological response to effectively any stressor. This could be an illness, this could be an infection, this could be trauma, this could be a surgery, this could be a training session. Any of these things, there's this coordinated physiological response. There are certain things that we can measure in the body, including in the blood, that increase during this acute phase response. And there are also other things that tend to decrease during this acute phase response pretty reliably. Vitamin D is something that decreases during this acute phase response. It is called a negative acute phase kind of reactant. It goes down in the setting of these kind of stressors. And like I said, there are tons of other things that tend to go way up. And this leads to a bunch of different kind of correlational analyses. The most common, again, these days that I see is people, again, sending me these COVID papers. They tell me people who were admitted to the hospital with higher levels of vitamin D did better compared to those who had lower levels of vitamin D. It's like, well, as it turns out, the person who was real sick, their vitamin Ds get suppressed more because they're having this massive systemic, immune response. Their levels get lower. So the person who's sicker, who is on the verge of death, yeah, they're going to do worse than the people who's having a milder, an easier go of it, whose levels are not as suppressed. So that's like the most extreme situation is when I'm seeing a patient with like sepsis in the ICU. And if I were to measure, I would never measure a vitamin D level on that person. If I could predict it's going to be what it's going to be, practically undetectable. But again, this extends to all sorts of other things. Even take a very healthy person, have them undergo some kind of a surgery. Take somebody who needs like a knee surgery or something. Their vitamin D levels will drop 20, 30, 40% post-operatively if you were to measure it. If somebody gets sick, if somebody does any of these things. So when it comes to training, the same thing can happen. Mm-hmm. So there are a couple interesting trials that show some of this and studies that show some of this. One was a study in military recruits where they were doing all their military boot camp PT training outdoors in the sun. And over the course of their military training, their vitamin D level went down. Over the course of this, doing all of this stuff outdoors, the physical stress of that hardcore training that they were doing led those levels go down. I'm completely unsurprised by this. There's another study that's been cited in one of these reviews on vitamin D in athletes that I actually came across in preparation for this podcast, where they had soccer players and they measured their levels in season, and then they measured them out of season during their like 6-week off-season period, and their vitamin D levels went up substantially during the off-season. And again, I'm like, it makes sense. They're training real hard. These things are going to go down. Is that pathologic? I would probably be on the skeptic side and say probably not pathologic, unless I saw evidence of, direct outcomes that could be ameliorated by fixing that level in season. But their levels went up in the off-season, and yet unsurprisingly, when they're not training and practicing, all their performance went down, because that's what happens when you're not training. Despite their vitamin D levels went up, that's a good thing, right? Like
they're all in the Bahamas on their 6-week holiday.
Exactly. And so that's one real important thing to keep in mind is just like, I really hammer, like we have people who post in our barbell medicine group vitamin D papers all the time. And
It's like, I just say, tell me what kind of study this was. And, when they look and they see this was either a cross-sectional or a retrospective or an observational association between low vitamin D levels and some poor outcome, I'm unsurprised. I'm no longer interested in these papers. Those papers have value in generating hypotheses. We've had enough hypothesis generation coming out of the vitamin D world with these correlational analyses. Let's move on from generating hypotheses and actually testing them. Fully agree, recognize, directly testing them in an RCT kind of context is not easy, is not simple for multiple reasons. You mentioned some, the seasonality, the placebo controlling, variability in the tests, like all kinds of things. Yes, it's complicated, but that doesn't make doing another cross-sectional analysis showing me that people with lower levels have worse outcomes any more useful. Like, I do not care about those anymore. And so I think that's one real important kind of takeaway that I would have hope that people would learn is anytime they get a PubMed link to a vitamin D paper, look and see what kind of paper we're dealing with. Is it correlational analysis, low status with poor outcomes? Unsurprising, trash bin. I want to see real outcomes from an intervention before I'm convinced that it is worth directly addressing this kind of a thing. When it comes to this topic that you brought up on the performance, I agree. The data are super messy. There's even some papers where they reported a positive outcome, and then I actually would pull the paper, and it's like one of my favorite things in sports science or like training papers is when they actually show individual subject level data pre-post. And so that's where you see like all the dots on the pre side for individual subjects, and then the lines from pre to post, and they're just going in every other all kinds of crazy directions, meaning people had all kinds of responses to this intervention. And maybe if you smash them all into one person and average it, then maybe you come out with that 0.2 effect size that Trexler recalculated. But how confident am I that you, the person, are going to be one of the people who went up and not down, right? I have no idea. Not to say that the supplement is going to make you worse, but maybe it's just as likely that you get no benefit out of it. Maybe I would probably be more confident in saying if you just did an extra set in your next training session, you're probably going to get more benefit than you would from taking that supplement, knowing nothing else about you. Again, if you were generally healthy, had no other issues, none of these significant risk factors. And so the last thing I'll say here is with respect to the infection piece, just because it is illustrative of one of the issues here. So Adrian Martineau is I think probably a big name in this vitamin D research world. He's had a few kind of metas on this and big analyses, including individual subject level data on risk of respiratory infection coming out over the course of a couple of years. The last one that was published was in the Lancet. I had previously done a research review kind of breakdown on one that he had done in 2017. Ultimately, the most recent one showed that among the people who are supplementing vitamin D, there was maybe over, I forget how long, maybe a year or something like that. It was a 63.3% chance of having a respiratory infection or symptoms of some kind. And the people who didn't supplement, it was a percentage point higher. So maybe a 1% absolute difference between the groups. So again, we need to be clear that if I could find an association paper that shows, for example, with COVID, same 25% risk of death in people who were deficient and 2% in people who weren't deficient. Again, when you just look at it cross-sectionally like that, but then you intervene and you see where did the effect go? And this is the theme, the pattern in this kind of vitamin D research. We see massive apparent effects in the observational data, right? I would expect major effects based on those kind of observational findings. And then you do a randomized trial, you actually do the intervention, and then poof, it almost all but disappears, or it might completely disappear with respect to certain outcomes. So in this meta-analysis that was done on respiratory infections, I actually pulled some of the trials and looked at them, broke it down based on how many actual respiratory infections were found in each trial. And how did that relate to the actual reported outcome in terms of the odds of vitamin D helping? So I'll just list a few. So in the first one, there was 9 cases of respiratory infection. That paper reported an odds ratio of 0.45, so major decreased odds of having a respiratory infection from vitamin D. One had 15 cases of infection. Their odds, again, 0.2, major decrease in odds of respiratory infection. Then you get up to the paper that had over 505 cases of respiratory infection, and their odds was 1.08. You have the paper that had 579 cases of respiratory infection, 1.03 odds. So the bigger the sample size got, the bigger the study got, the more these results tended towards the null. So this is, you're familiar with, small study bias and things like that. These smaller papers, smaller interventions. Of course, you might by chance end up with these kind of pretty massive looking effects, even in an intervention kind of setting, independent of this observational stuff. So I do all that rambling just to illustrate again how messy, how complicated this is. But if we think about like the papers that Neve was mentioning, where they look at older folks, for example, who are like struggling to get out of a chair, that's like maybe my usual inpatient that I might see. The most physically, weak, frail individual, the beginner when it comes to training, right? Who is most likely to benefit? If there is a benefit from this, who is most likely to benefit? The person who has like no physical strength, right? And we're just getting them moving. I feel like that's the situation where I would expect, if there is a significant effect, that's probably where I would expect to see it. Compared to at the end of, somebody who squats 600, what are the odds that I'm going to see a significant effect on somebody who's already training multiple times a week, is paying attention to their sleep, is living a generally healthy lifestyle? Like the odds that I see a substantial impact there, if I don't see one in the other situation where the person's not doing anything and has like all these health issues that could theoretically be ameliorated by this, it becomes like implausible in my opinion. So that's kind of why on multiple levels this is complicated, this is messy, and why I think it's just best again to focus on outcomes, and recognizing all the things that can make vitamin D go down, even if it's just training. So if you're training hard, right? Like I like to think that I train reasonably hard. I wouldn't be surprised if I went and got checked if my levels were, maybe just a little bit below the normal limit. Feel fine. Everything seems to be going okay. My personal, position or choice for this for myself is it's still not worth it for me to commit to taking a pill supplement every day. If somebody else, to answer your very original question, says, I'm going to take 1,000 IUs a day, I think the odds of that harming you are zero, effectively. There are very few things I'm willing to be that confident on, but that is not going to harm you. Is there some plausible benefit from it? Again, I think it is very small. And if you listen to people who comment on this with perhaps less familiarity with all this data, it is the potential benefit, if it's there, is way, 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 way smaller than you think. And if that potential benefit is worth it to you, like I said, there's probably a whole bunch of other things you should be willing to do if you're gonna be, clear with your criteria for what justifies you doing something.
I'm willing to do it all, Austin. Everything. And so, yeah, that's one of my two not serious comments. The other one is make sure you please hit up Austin_barbell medicine with your cross-sectional data. Just message him any and all correlational studies you can find on vitamin D. And then my final serious comment was just for those when he was going through odds ratios. That's a really simple thing to interpret. An odds ratio of 1 means that the two things you're being compared have 100% the same risk. So if you see an odds ratio of 0.2, it's 20% of the risk. If it's 1.03, it's 3% more risk. So it's just a great way to look at the relative risk comparing two things. So anytime you're reading ratios that papers that reports odds risk ratios, that's an easy way just to interpret it for all you PubMed ninjas out there. But I think that was a fantastic summary. And I do think, Omar, I don't know about you, but I think the typical calculus, even in like the evidence-based lifting community, of what is the threshold I will use before I buy a supplement, try a protocol or something like that, is somewhat informed by research, but it's also partially informed by how much research on this topic right now is being talked about by people who I think are evidence-based, not the actual strength of the data. I don't know about what you think about that.
Yeah, 100%. I think what I identified is that Austin's not a bodybuilder, because around here we use the phrase of neutral to positive. So it just has to not be harmful, right? The Hippocratic Oath to ourselves. It's like, could it have any benefit? Probably not, but we're going to make sure we uncover every proverbial rock. And that's why I am curious. I do have two questions, but I want to ask both you, Eric, and then Austin this question, because in the evidence-based space, or let's just say, Eric, the high-performance athletes, vitamin D has really fallen, at least from my observation, by the wayside, because there's no allure. I think novelty brings an allure, right? So it's not sexy anymore. A decade ago, it's kind of like the ketogenic diet for the general population is now resurging in the conversation. But in this space, like you want to deadlift 700 pounds, no one's really talking about it. And you see that population difference, because I do have to bring up Eric Trexler, our boy. I want to apologize if he listens to this, because I brought him on Ancient Aliens on Ancient Workouts, Eric, and the amount of people that try to eviscerate him. So I brought him, Austin, on to talk about fiber and basically the carnivore diet and dispelling some of the myths. And the amount of like pro-carnivore people that came on that episode to basically call Eric Trexler, this is no joke, a quack. We said, oh, he's a fiber junkie. Oh, that makes sense. And it blew my mind. Like, I felt bad because it's like it's bringing someone with legit knowledge to a mass audience to explain things and just to be completely interpreted. It really did make me sad. So
that
sorry.
population is impossible to interact with. I will grant you that.
Right. And that's, I guess that's my question for both of you, because Austin, you're in a unique position being both a doctor and then a coach. So I'm sure the types of questions you get asked, especially when you do seminars and whatnot, would be a little different than the average coach. So first I want to ask Eric and then you the same question. Vitamin D was on that trajectory, right? You had what, like arginine, beta alanine, citrulline malate. You go down the list, right? Like shout out Barbell Medicine to the other Barbell Medicine. Jordan, I tried at Alan Thrall's gym the pre-workout gains. It was delicious. It had at the time HMB, and like HMB at the time, it's like, oh, there's probably some purported benefit. We wait. This is the cycle right now in 2022. It's terkesterone. We know this, so. It's not really talked about, is what I'm saying. Vitamin D for its purported benefits. Cool. But do you notice, and this is for Austin afterwards, do you notice an increased prevalence of vitamin D questions now that we're in a COVID climate? And that is the serious question, because it's part of that COVID cocktail. And then from Eric, your perspective too, because people will ask you more in-depth nutritional questions, and they try and use that intersection of, let's say, health, however you define it, and performance. So you probably would get more questions than like someone's that's just about gains. Is it in the conversation at all still, vitamin D, in terms of athletic performance and health? I want to start first with you and then to Austin with the exact same question, because I'm curious.
Yeah, it is. And
so
it's definitely still in the conversation. I do think the hype train was biggest in the mid to 2000s to like end of the 2000s, early 2010 era. And I think there just was the data has been messy the whole time and unclear and neutral to positive, as we've been saying for the most part. But when you take something that's neutral to positive, which, like, I think Austin is very correct in classifying this, that's most stuff that does not creatine or caffeine for supplements, right? There's probably actually a lot more that's neutral to neutral, but there is a fair amount of stuff that's like, maybe, and all you have to do is throw on anecdotes on top of that, and that neutral to positive moves from small positive to maybe larger positive that the science hasn't found yet in the collective consciousness of athletes. And I think we've probably moved away from the era where we are small positive to maybe amazing if the science would just catch up, to back to neutral to positive. And most people, in my circles are willing to, spend that money for that daily dose of their 1 to 2,000 IUs.
Yeah, my position on this, I think, is that I agree that it was hyped before, but it is unlike some of those other things that you mentioned, because some of those other things went straight to the trash bin.
Sure.
Instead, vitamin D, maybe the absolute hype phase has passed, but that's because now it is just accepted as good and you want it, and that more is better, for at least in some circles. So it's an issue because the hype and Eric, you tried to characterize my position before we started the podcast, and it was close, but not entirely accurate, because I would not say that it does nothing for any health outcome. I think that obviously there's some established function for it and value for it in the realm of bone health in particular. I think extraskeletal health is way weaker in terms of, the evidence we have to support driving levels up for extras outside of the bone health kind of area. But if I could really characterize it, it is that just like public enthusiasm for this so far outstrips the actual evidence for its effectiveness in a bunch of areas. And if I had a goal, it would not be for like everybody to just like throw it away necessarily, but it would be just to like line these things up a little bit better in terms of people's enthusiasm for it with the actual evidence for it. So there's a researcher who I've read a fair amount of his papers. His name is Jorde, Jorde. And one of his papers towards the end, I'm just going to read this quote, says, "Not only the general public, but also the ethical committees seem to be convinced that we need more vitamin D and higher serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels. As a result, it is often judged unethical to include subjects with low vitamin D concentrations in randomized controlled trials where vitamin D is compared to placebo." So in biomedical research, there's this concept called equipoise. Equipoise refers to there has to be genuine uncertainty about whether something is actually beneficial or harmful in order to make it ethical to do a trial, right? So there are certain things that I agree will never be studied because now by this point, it's either wholly unethical or it is firmly established that this has benefit, and it's unethical to put somebody in the other arm of the study. Here, they're basically saying that like our window of opportunity for like doing quality RCTs on this may actually be behind us, because the hype is, again, so far ahead of where the actual evidence is. I do not think, and Neve, you mentioned this, that and basically echoing what's in this quote, that a lot of IRBs, for example, might not allow you ethically to randomize people who are deficient to a certain arm of the trial. My personal thought is we still have this idea of clinical equipoise there. We still have this genuine uncertainty. How much is this person actually being harmed by being at this level? Like you said, for a few months, I think the odds that they have a catastrophic outcome from this, very, very low. I think there is genuine uncertainty, and some of these things could be tested, but both in the lay public, now it seems like, again, in the scientific realm, certainly among lifters, the hype it's just accepted. Like, I think it's just too far gone. I'm fighting a losing battle here, trying to get people to like kind of rein in their enthusiasm. At least that's what it feels like. And to your question about COVID, I mean, 100%, that is very much it feels almost like a lost cause that, I unfortunately will open Twitter sometimes and see some see some very frustrating commentary. Again, most of it, people will post a link, it'll look scientific. I'll say, let me guess what I'm about to find. It's going to be an observational analysis. 20% risk reduction in death from taking a vitamin. From this,
that's Austin _ barbell medicine to send your observational trials
send me your hate. Yeah, that's right. So yes, the hype is there. I think even if it's not as hot as it was a decade ago, I think it's just because now it's just effectively established in people's mind without necessarily the requisite evidence base to make it truly an evidence, an established kind of therapy with clear benefit on real human outcomes.
It's a good answer. And I think we've covered a lot of ground. I'm sensitive of both of your guys' time and patience. But also, I'm aware that you two are the experts here. So I want to open the floor to both of you. Is there anything up to this point that you feel maybe we haven't touched on it in enough depth, or we've neglected to discuss, that you want to cover before we close this episode out? Neve, Austin, floor is yours.
No, I think the only thing that I would say, and particularly I would say this quite a bit coming from a nutrition background, is people are always looking for the silver bullet. But if you're not covering the basics, if you're not sleeping good, if your stress levels are high, if your diet in general is quite poor, you're going to have poor outcomes. And it doesn't matter how much vitamin D or vitamin B or vitamin whatever you're going to take on top of all of that, you're not good. It's a waste of time. And I also think one of the best aids is just a really good playlist. So if you're looking for any kind of performance enhancement, I think that's the only thing that's guaranteed to help. Otherwise, yeah, just hold off on the vitamin D. And same thing as well. If you open a paper and the conclusion is this may have, and it's just very wishy-washy, they haven't done anything, put it away. It would be on the front of every paper if we've really demonstrated something big with vitamin D. So yeah, there's a lot of noise out there. So the last thing just around COVID, I know it's kind of, it's a tricky one, but it kind of re-shows this poor scientific communication around vitamin D in an environment where people had different risk perceptions and different levels of fear, of anxiety. And the majority of people who got in touch with me about it were older adults who'd taken part in my research projects before, with genuine concern and fear, and trying to do everything that they possibly could to overcome it. So I think that's just something that, as like a nutritionist or somebody working with athletes or anyone in the general population, is to always kind of go back to them and reassure them, because there should be less trust, I suppose, in what's being distributed kind of more in mainstream kind of media.
Well said.
Yeah, to echo the first thing you mentioned there about the more general health promoting activities, I think that there's something that I hear a lot about physicians, this common claim that doctors, for example, treat symptoms and not root causes and things like that. That's a very common claim among typically quacks. That's my bias. But here, we have a situation where vitamin D is a pretty consistent, robust marker of general health in a variety of ways. And so if I did, for some reason, measure somebody's blood vitamin D level and it was found to be low, my first move is going to be looking for what are the other things that are going on with this person that could be contributing to that. Are they carrying maybe a little excess body fat? We know that obesity decreases the rate of adding that 25 hydroxy onto it to turn it, and then increases the rate that it gets inactivated. So, and it can also, this vitamin can get sequestered in body fat and things like that. So that can be a reason why it could be low. Do they have some other kind of inflammatory condition going on? Do they have major stressors? How's their sleep? How's their, physical activity, sunlight exposure? Are they training? Are they doing a CrossFit hero WOD or something right before they go to the lab to get their blood drawn? Yeah, your vitamin D is probably going to be low if you do that right after that, right? This kind of thing. Again, stuff drives it down. So I might be looking more for other things going on with the person and targeting my advice in ways that I can feel more confident is going to improve their health, to get their physical activity, maybe improve their programming. If it's like a coaching client, getting their sleep on track, getting their body fat, working towards a healthy body composition, things like that, because I can feel more confident that doing those things is going to have a tangible impact on their health trajectory, rather than, again, making your number look pretty on a blood test. I'm less confident in that for most people.
Well said. I think that's a great summary and finishing statement. Omar, anything else you want to add?
No, I think they nailed it. We want to ask where we can find them.
Well, I'm really, really old school, okay? I don't use social media at all, and I don't want to give out my postal address because that could just get weird. But I can share my LinkedIn. I can maybe send it to you guys, and you can put it online.
We'll link it in the description, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Don't send us the postal address, especially since you advise people to go outside naked in the sun. You'd probably get a whole lot of nudes. So, like questions, the email would be like, is this a sufficient vitamin D protocol? And you open it and you're like, oh my God, immediately close. So just a fancy way of sending pics that should not be sent to anybody. Awesome. Fantastic. We'll link that in there, and so much appreciation for you being on the show. Austin, how about you, man? Where do people find you?
Anywhere you can find Barbell Medicine's stuff, YouTube, podcast, website, my Instagram, which you have kindly provided people on multiple occasions so far.
I got you. I got you, brother.
And then I'm on Twitter, but that's mainly for my own purposes. I do most of my scientific paper acquisition through following people there. So I like Twitter the most as far as scientific interest and medical stuff. So,
yep, finding those correlational studies. Totally understood.
Follow Austin at Mr. Barbell Medicine. It was quite clear. I think both of you did a fantastic job, and we will leave links in the description for everyone. Please bother Austin. Please be respectful to Neve once again with the LinkedIn, because that is a professional. That is a professional thing. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out. 5-star. We believe in freedom of choice, but there's a clear right answer, like everything, and it's 5 stars right here. We're back every single Monday, and we'll catch you in that next episode.